Hello, my name is Sean Stevens from GLIO, the Global Listed Infrastructure Organisation. Today we're joined by Mark Aurier, CEO of Chorus Limited, and Eric Bright, Infrastructure Fund Manager with the Foresight Group, for the latest edition of the GLIO CEO Investor Interviews. So let's join Mark and Eric.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction, and a big thank you to GLIO for setting this up. I'm Eric Bright. I'm a Managing Director and Portfolio Manager at Foresight Group. I'm really pleased to be here today for a conversation with Chorus. Chorus are a New Zealand listed fibre network owner. The business plays a pretty critical role in New Zealand's digital infrastructure network, and I think is a great example of the broad opportunities that are available today to investors in listed infrastructure. I'm joined by Mark Aurier. Mark's the CEO of Chorus. He's here to help us unpack the business in a bit more detail. Mark, thanks for joining us. Perhaps we could start with you introducing yourself.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, well, I'm the Chief Executive for Chorus, who are New Zealand's largest fibre network provider, and we're dual listed entity on both New Zealand and Australian stock exchanges. I've had over 20 years working in the telco industry in New Zealand, across Asia and the UK, primarily in mobile and other converged businesses before jumping into the wonderful world of fibre. A lot of that's been with Vodafone, several executive roles, and more recently as Chief Executive for 2 Degrees here in New Zealand before joining Chorus just over 2 years ago. But I'd say this is an industry that I truly love, and particularly how connectivity shapes both current and future generations, generally for the better.
Great. Okay, so maybe let's begin with a brief history lesson. Perhaps you could talk us through the origins of Chorus as a business, and I think particularly relevant is the relationship with the government in New Zealand.
Sure. Yeah. Bringing high-speed fibre connectivity in New Zealand started back as a proposal in 2008, when very few countries were really even looking at fibre deployment. And at the time, it would be fair to say there was a lot of pushback on the government and investment. But we had a small group of visionaries who really had the courage and the temperament to keep pushing. And that proposal would then go on to become the ultra-fast broadband, or UFB program, that was really premised on building a new fibre network that would be open access. And that was built off a public and private partnership with the government. And it was aimed to avoid excessive duplication. So today what we have, we've passed 87% of the New Zealand population who have access to high-speed fibre connectivity. And now it's actually regarded as one of the most successful PPP examples in New Zealand history.
Great. And I guess for those that are watching this and maybe are more aware of fibre markets globally, what are a few key differences that they should be aware of when it comes to Chorus?
Yeah, there are a few key differences. I think the first I'd say is the open access. So as Chorus, we can't retail. So we're wholesale only. We have around 90 retail service providers, or RSPs, across the country, of which there are 3 large mobile network operators who make up about 75% of broadband market share. But like many other countries, you continue to see newer electricity and TV bundlers that are entering the market and continuing to gain share and momentum as well. The second, I'd say the PPP model itself defined initial geographic areas for fibre deployment, and that's quite different. And that means that we have limited overbuild, unlike many other countries. So you get a lot better capital efficiency. The government financing was an interest-free loan, so not ownership, and that was allocated back to 4 local fibre companies across those separate geographic areas to then reach out to 87% of the population, of which, if you think about Chorus, we've been allocated the majority, so about 75% of the build. Perhaps another difference is on the regulatory side. We've got a very clear approach to being able to exit legacy copper technology, which is really key. We've legislated for copper withdrawal, so there's a code that actually enables us as network providers to notify and then migrate customers from copper to fibre quickly. So think about within 6 months. If you can compare that to other markets that can see similar migration over a number of years. So obviously that's accelerated our ability to drive the uptake of fibre and move off legacy copper services. So not only are we moving customers faster to future fit technology, but we have a pathway to exit copper and realise those significant savings that go with terminating legacy services. And maybe the final difference I'd call out is on a benchmark basis, if you look at the result and the maturity of New Zealand, and it's evolved rapidly. So where for a country of roughly only 5 million people, New Zealand's ranked 19th in the world for fibre penetration and uptake. So again, the 87% of premises passed and already 72% uptake. And we've got aspirations to get to 80% by 2030. And if you think of the backdrop from an economic perspective, the deployment of fibre alone has already delivered $31 billion of economic and productivity gains to date to the country. And that's forecast to grow to over $140 billion over the next 10 years.
Yeah. Speaks to the kind of critical nature of the network, right? I guess before we dive into Chorus in more detail, we've seen some notable transaction activity in fibre markets this year. What do you think that tells us about fibre as an investment more broadly?
Yeah, good point. And for me, it's not a surprise. Broadband really isn't a luxury service anymore. It's become essential digital infrastructure. And we certainly see fibre as the gold standard in broadband technology. It's more resilient, efficient, scalable, and it really is future fit for purpose. And our needs only continue to grow. So I think the evolutions to IP-based content as consumers, and equally from an enterprise perspective, I think infrastructure, cloud and AI services are only going to increase that dependency on technology. And it's technology that really needs to be scalable. And that's what fibre is. And we're seeing a lot of M&A activity. I think if you look at the United States as an example, with the larger telcos acquiring fibre networks with T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T. And for me, I believe those acquisitions reflect more of the forward planning. So right now, 5G fixed wireless is still relatively new and it has latent capacity, but that will change over time as that capacity is filled and then the economics change. And I'd say I equally believe that thinking really recognises the scalability again of fibre infrastructure and the longer term value and yield that it returns. Finally, I'd say, when you think about fibre and other technologies, given the climate that we're living in, it'd be remiss not to recognise the relative sustainability, where fibre is significantly more efficient to run than some of the traditional wireless and copper networks.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so maybe we'll kind of use that as a reason to explore Chorus as an investment opportunity. So I think infrastructure investors and infrastructure markets are very familiar with regulated businesses. Could you perhaps explain to us how Chorus falls under a regulated model and what that means for the business?
Sure. We operate under a regulatory regime, and in simple terms, think of about a building block model that's been in place since 2022 in New Zealand. So similar to the electricity networks models, our regulator made an assessment of the starting value of our regulated asset base. They apply a WACC to that amongst other input methodologies, as well as setting allowances for CapEx and OpEx. And that can sound quite complex, but in reality, it provides a consistency and a degree of certainty that comes with regulation. And that was designed to set a maximum allowable revenue that if we under-earn it, then we get a wash-up allowance in the next regulatory period. Indexation adjustments happen to the regulated asset base each year with inflation. So inflation for New Zealand, we're currently running at about 2.5% or so. And for context, think about a WACC for the period that we're currently in of just around 7.7%. And that regulatory period, we just finished our first 3 year, finished in December 2024, and we're now into our second regulatory period that will run for 4 years out to the end of 2028.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the difference of Chorus as a fibre owner and effectively have a slightly de-risk play on fibre versus other markets, right? So I guess to build out that network, you've had a heavy period of CapEx. The network now is pretty much built out. We expect that you'll generate some significant free cash flow as we move forward. How should investors think about capital allocation? And maybe you can comment on the dividend being a pretty key component of forward-looking returns from here.
Sure. So, the fibre rollout to the 87% of population was completed at the back end of 2022. So we're still connecting premises, and like many other countries, there's still significant new property development inside existing fibre footprints, and that also generates additional installations. But as I said earlier, we're at 72% fibre uptake on those premises already. So the scale of installation capex is naturally reducing while fibre revenues are obviously growing. That's partially offset by the withdrawal of the copper network, which means obviously reducing revenues, but also reducing the associated costs. So considering that not that long ago in New Zealand history, 100% of broadband users were on copper, today that's less than 10%. And we've highlighted that also gives us an opportunity, like many other markets are starting to look at copper recovery and sale of those cables, specifically the more larger copper cables. Obviously, that depends on market conditions, but that could yield $30 to $50 million on resale over the next 5 to 7 years for what is essentially going to become a redundant asset. In terms of our capital management framework, so we reviewed that and reset it probably this time last year, and it was appropriate to do so as we headed into that new and second regulatory period, and we'll continue to do the same ahead of the 2029 and third regulatory period. Our focus, though, as part of that framework has been on operating free cash flow, less sustaining capex or maintenance capex. And we aim to pay 70 to 90% of that on average over time as an ordinary dividend. And we've given that guidance really overall of delivering a sustainable growing dividend, at least in real terms.
Yeah. Okay, great. So you kind of touched on it there a little bit, but digital infrastructure is an ever developing market. We've moved from copper to fibre, and that's still in flux to some degree. I guess maybe just commenting on where we are with that, but then maybe moving forward as well, just commenting on how fibre actually has a place where it can sustain now and can support ultimately faster speeds across the network. And as we move into an increasingly digital world, why fibre is well placed to support us.
Yeah, copper, as I say, continues to decline rapidly as it does in many other markets because there are far better alternatives available. If I look at Chorus's customer base on copper, it declined by 40% year on year. And we have less than 100,000 customers now remaining on copper overall. So in designated fibre areas where we cover that 87% of the population, we're aiming to be completely out of copper by mid-2026. And in areas that fibre is available, we've been able to migrate roughly 80% of broadband customers directly from copper to fibre. So there's a high rate of conversion. And I think that's a recognition, again, of the superiority of fibre as a technology. In the non-fibre areas, the 13% of the population, that's obviously a little more difficult. We don't have the service for that to transfer to. However, our own regulator commissioned a rural connectivity study, and that highlighted that 97% of premises that are in non-fibre areas can already access better alternatives to copper now. So if you think wireless internet service providers, fixed wireless access with the mobile operators, or obviously the LEO satellites. And our argument to and challenge to the government has also been to think about expanding fibre further. So we've submitted a proposal on expanding from 87% of the population to 95%, and we think there's a genuine use case for that. That's going to require financial support through government or third-party investment. But having seen the significant benefits, both economic and productivity gains that I talked to earlier, these also exist for expanding further into the 95%, roughly in the order of $17 billion over the next 10 years for expanding fibre out further. So, but fibre isn't the answer on its own. In reality, copper's got to go. It's an obsolete technology. There are better alternatives already available. And when you do look at fibre, as I say, we see it certainly as the gold standard and it's future fit for purpose.
Yeah. And so maybe touching on the future, there's a few themes that I think are worth talking about as we move forward. One of which is the fact that you've called publicly for the simplification of regulation. What would that mean for Chorus on a move forward basis?
Yeah, look, Chorus is subject to multiple layers of telco regulation that have really built up over years. And at the time, they made sense, right? Particularly as Chorus was born out of what was telecom, and we had structural separation here for the retail and the wholesaler. But many of those now are just outdated constructs that really no longer apply. And we've called for simplification of the regime to reduce some of that regulatory burden. And we've been pretty vocal about this. And really pleased to see recently the government announced here a review over the next 6 months that is going to consider a number of things. And maybe to pick up on some of those examples that we've been pushing, because they're probably similar for other markets. The first is around reporting and really streamlining the amount of information that we have to submit at each regulatory review. If we're not performing as expected, tell us. Otherwise, let's reduce the volume of information that actually has to be provided. The second is around ownership for us. So as Chorus, we have a legacy 10% shareholder ownership cap that's been in place since structural separation that, in our mind, restricts liquidity and investment to date. And it's already on top of other regulatory conditions. So when you look across New Zealand, no other New Zealand-based telco provider, whether you think a mobile operator, a local fibre company, or a tower company, has the same restrictions. So what is it that makes Chorus so special that we need to have this condition in place? And as we say, so it's an outdated construct, and in our mind, it impedes potential investment. Third's on pricing. At the moment, we have a requirement to provide fibre and rural services at the same prices as urban. But when you obviously look at wireless operators who operate networks in rural, they're charging more because actually it costs more to deliver into those rural areas. So we've asked for a review around the geographic consistent pricing condition that we have in place, and that should actually be removed. And then the last to touch on is TSO, so a telecoms service obligation, which again, many markets and countries have. We've asked the government to look at this as well, around that service obligation that was inherited back in the early 2000s, frankly, and that required the ongoing supply of copper services to addresses at the time. But when you consider the rapid shutdown of copper and particularly what's happening in global markets as well, it's not just a New Zealand thing, and the fact that, as I say, 97% of addresses in non-fibre areas already have access to better alternative services, then we don't see that there's really a need to keep this TSO going.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. You've touched on this a little bit as we've gone through this conversation, but we've spoken about the sort of advances in technology, and we've moved from copper to fibre, etc. But there are now other technologies that are emerging, and some of which are well established. Technologies like Starlink and also fixed wireless options. How should investors think about Chorus compared to those markets? Are they something that competes, or do they really just sit alongside the broader Chorus offering?
Yeah, look, I'd say there's a place for all technologies. And when we think about LEO satellite here and fixed wireless, and particularly in rural areas or where there's no fibre today, they're actually helping us to exit from copper because, as we say, we openly acknowledge that there are alternative services that are better to copper. But given that we don't have the same withdrawal code in those rural areas that we do in urban or fibre areas, it makes it a little more challenging. So, as I say, we actually see them almost as a benefit or an aid. In urban areas, fixed wireless in New Zealand has, it's probably a little unique, it has around 15-16% roughly of market share. That was really born out of the days when copper, I think ADSL in particular, or VDSL was available and fibre wasn't available. 4G fixed wireless access at the time presented quite an appealing alternative. If you roll forward now to where fibre is, and when you think that's 16%, let's say, of market share in those urban areas, that represents a significant win-back opportunity for Chorus and from fibre. because, I will stand by fiber every day as the gold standard, and certainly, compared to a 4G fixed wireless technology that in itself is aging. We also continue to leverage the innovation around fiber to highlight that superiority. Most recently, we've just taken our lowest end plans and upgraded them as a speed boost for free to customers. That's taken our 50 megabit fiber plan to 100 megs, and the 300 going to 500 megabits. And there's always that question about what speed you need, but I think perhaps a way to reframe it is thinking about it as perhaps a little bit more than what you're used to. And what we consistently see with customers that are going on to higher speed broadband plans is that they use more data. And perhaps it's, be seen as a little cynical. Of course, we say that fibre is the gold standard, but from a reporting perspective here, our own regulator, the Commerce Commission, do monitoring reports themselves and publish them each quarter. And that clearly shows fibre's superiority. When you think about latency and download and uplink speeds versus those alternative broadband solutions, it does come out as fibre being the clear gold standard. Again, I go back to those characteristics that are very clear. It is more resilient, it's more scalable, and it is your future fit technology.
Yeah. And I think as consumers, we've shown consistently year over year that we want faster connectivity and we consume more and more data. I think the AI boom in recent years is the next stage of that, right? And it's definitely caught the attention of investors, and it's playing out in digital infrastructure markets in real time. Where does Chorus sit in this theme?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. It seems like every other article that I read today, is about the growth of data centers or AI or the connectivity that's required. But, realistically, if we think about where we are in this evolution now, all that growth is still primarily cloud-based connectivity requirements. It's that the evolution of generative AI in itself is evolving rapidly, but the connectivity requirements for that are just going to exponentially explode, most likely when we figure out what it is that AI is going to, and the role that it's going to play in our lives. So I think from a Chorus perspective and as a fibre network owner, we're an enabler for that. And if I think about New Zealand right now, we have around 60 data centres across New Zealand. But we're seeing the more recent entry of hyperscalers here that are coming online. New Zealand in itself is well positioned and potentially presents a compelling case even for large DC builds. We have comparatively lower land prices, access to high renewable energy, so we're over 80% renewables, and lower ambient temperature, particularly the further south you go in New Zealand. From a Chorus perspective, we previously announced that we were exploring the build for a new subsea cable, providing connectivity as a ring between Auckland, Sydney, Melbourne, back to the South Island in New Zealand and Invercargill. And that would then effectively connect back to our terrestrial land-based fibre network. So, there's a lot of movement and activity in this market, and I don't expect it's going to slow down. But again, all those characteristics of a fibre network play well into that.
Yeah, great, interesting. And maybe we can just take a step back and kind of wrap up on that. So I guess keen to hear from you on what you feel is underappreciated when we think about the Chorus investment proposition as a whole. And I guess as part of that, what does a successful 3 to 5 year period for the business look like?
Perhaps if I do one point as a reflection and say that the history to current day, I think what's underappreciated is, and it's maybe because New Zealand's so far away or it's seen as a smaller market, but I don't think that Chorus gets that recognition that's due for what's already been achieved. For all the things I've spoken to earlier, New Zealand is one of the leading markets and providers in the world. 87% passed already, 72% that have already taken up fibre, and well on our exit to copper being gone completely. And it shows that Chorus has the credibility to not only build but connect and to operate at large scale. maybe the second point, if I then roll forward and think about a reflection of the future potential, this time last year or so, we reset our strategy under a premise of our road to 2030. So thinking that 5-year vision out. And that recognised Chorus moving from a model of what perhaps in the past was the great network builder and maybe evolving towards being the great network operator. And that's different mindset, different capabilities. And that's a midterm future Chorus that reflects a simpler, more efficient, more competitive, more innovative operator. And we may have finished the original build, but there are still large pools available for growth. And equally, as we exit from the legacy copper technology and move to a single fibre technology, there are also material savings to realise. And perhaps finally, from a broader investment perspective, I said earlier in referencing the current 10% share ownership cap. Again, it's an outdated construct. We're pushing hard to have that removed because I can't see the rationale of this continuing. But that paves the way for large infrastructure investment that looks at Chorus as an already highly successful fibre provider that really has demonstrated that credibility to build and operate and to continue to grow at scale.
Yeah. I guess it seems to me that there's a lot of kind of hypothesizing in digital infrastructure at the moment. What you have here with fibre is a network that is built, established, and it's a technology that we know works. And so as we move forward with AI and whatever else, it's going to play a role in that somehow. That to me is super exciting. Great. Okay. Well, thank you for your answers. Super detailed. It's been really, really interesting to hear about the story. I guess final question would be, where can investors go if they're interested to hear more about the business?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. I mean, look, there's the investor section on our website, chorus.co.nz, that has all of our presentation materials, including our most recent Investor Day that was webcast back in December of last year. And that really did provide a comprehensive look into the business. You know, as I just said, thinking back about the history and the legacy and where Chorus has come from, but equally thinking about that road to 2030, thinking about how Chorus shows up as that simpler, more efficient, more innovative, more competitive, and with significant opportunities. But everything can be on the website there.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And thanks again to GLIO for teeing this up.
Thanks, Eric. Pleasure.
Thank you, Mark and Eric, for the great insight into the telecoms infrastructure sector and the New Zealand market. Before we end, please don't forget to look out for the summer edition of the GLIO Journal. It should be arriving in your inboxes and postboxes before the start of the summer holidays. Goodbye.